I'm Esther, Giles. I'm chairing this meeting today, and I'd like to welcome all of you to the meeting this afternoon. This is the second event organised by the Labour Campaign for Free Speech, for the defence of Professor David Miller and for academic freedom and free speech. We're really pleased that around 350 people have registered for this meeting today. We're also live streaming the meeting, so other people may be watching it there. I expect that most of you know that David Miller is under threat of suspension from his university job because he has expressed views on the state of Israel and on Zionism. Those who seek to get David fired from his job won't stop there. Other academics who are critical of Israel will be targeted and possibly fired. And it won't take much of this to persuade other academics to stop speaking out against Israel's policies for fear of losing their careers. As Calhoun said, the issue is not whether free speech is repressed, important and basic as that is, or whether individuals suffer in their careers for expressing controversial views. It is whether and how universities bring knowledge, diverse perspectives and competing analysis into the public sphere. I'm going to quote the UCU, the University College Union 2016. One of the purposes of post-compulsory education is to serve the public interest through extending knowledge and understanding and fostering critical thinking and expression for staff and students, and then in society more widely. Academic freedom is essential to achieving these ends and therefore to the development of a civilized democracy. Today, we welcome a range of speakers from different backgrounds: music and activism, academic life, both university and secondary, trade unions, UCU and NEU, writers and journalists. Each will speak to into their perspective on academic freedom and free speech, including the international example of Julian Assange. I've also received these words from Palestinian students locally. Although it has unfortunately become quite regular at this point, it is an especially difficult time to be a Palestinian in Bristol and the United Kingdom. The recent events have really made it clear how any discussion of Zionism as an atrocious racist project is being immediately mistaken for anti-Semitism. There has been no regard for evidence-based research, human rights cases, and ultimately the Palestinian narrative, the experiences of Palestinians and Arabs of Muslim, Christian, and Jewish descent, their history and the current circumstances in the illegal apartheid regime. Nevertheless, we will continue to fight for justice, for freedom, for Palestine. I would like in advance to thank all our speakers today and to express once more our support for and solidarity with Professor David Miller. So now on to our speakers. I'm very pleased to announce our first speaker is Lowkey, who, as you'll know, I'm sure, British-Iraqi rapper and activist. He's going to explore some perspectives on Zionism and current day Islamophobia and draw, I think, comparisons between Zionism and free speech past and present. So over to you, Lowkey. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. And firstly, I would like to state my solidarity with David Miller. I think there has been some great work in supporting him, but I think that one particular point, and I'm sure that others will deal with other points, but one particular point which I don't think he's adequately been defended upon is the convergence of interests and Zionist involvement in the propagating of Islamophobia around the world. This is verifiable, documented fact in a book that he worked on with Tom Mills and others, Nazanin Massoumi and others. There is a fantastic chapter by Sarah Marusek, which goes in forensic detail into how 75% of the organizations which fund think tanks that produce this irrationalizing narrative about Muslims around the world, from Middle East Forum to others, 75% of the organizations that fund them also fund the building of Israeli settlements. If we were to talk about in this country two main figureheads of Islamophobia, many would say Tommy Robinson and Katie Hopkins. Well, not enough real critical thinking was applied when looking at who funded the Free Tommy campaign and who paid for Tommy Robinson's legal fees during that process. It was Middle East Forum, the same organization that has produced work that Anders Breivik quoted 13 times in his manifesto when he murdered 77 people. The director of Middle East Forum is Greg Roman, a former employee of the Israeli Ministry of Defense and the Foreign Ministry. Tommy Robinson was also a Shillman Fellow. He was, according to his former employee, Lucy Brown, given £10,000 per month by big tech billionaire Robert Shillman. Robert Shillman formerly was on the board of directors for the Friends of the IDF. He also funds the Christians United for Israel, the Jewish National Fund, and the Zionist Organization of America. Tommy Robinson said clearly when he went to the West Bank and the Golan Heights and he posed on the back of an IDF tank holding a weapon, later on he said that he would fight for Israel if there was a war. This was not given any real critical attention by the media in this country. We look at Katie Hopkins and know that she was also funded by Robert Shillman and David Horowitz. If we look deeper at a character like Sheldon Adelson, now much was made of his funding for Israeli settlements, giving over 100 million over the space of 4 years, funding organizations like Birthright Israel, Christians United for Israel, Jewish National Fund, Zionist Organization of America. But less was made of his funding for organizations like Memory, the Foundation for Defense of Democracy, and Camera, all organizations that have pushed out Islamophobic, non-peer-reviewed studies all across the internet. The Marcus Foundation is another one that has given tens of millions to Islamophobic organizations and also to Israeli settlement organizations. That leads us to Paul E. Singer, top Republican donor, billionaire in the US, who through his foundation has funded Birthright Israel, Friends of the IDF, the Israel Independence Fund, but also on top of that has funded the NGO Monitor in Jerusalem, the European Foundation for Democracy, and Memory. All of these groups are identified by Sarah Marusek in her fantastic chapter as part of the Islamophobia industry. Paul Singer has also gone about setting up something called Startup National Central. Now, this organization is built to combat BDS by feeding into major tech companies, employees of former employees of Unit 8200 in the IDF. They have, and this is Paul Singer in direct cooperation with major figures in the Israeli government, working to put these people in their place. There's a brilliant article by Whitney Webb that went into this in serious detail. What you have is a situation where they've identified over 13 former employees of Unit 8200 currently in Facebook and more in organizations like Google and Microsoft. What we see in terms of the parameters of debate around the plight of Palestinians in this country, in France, in Germany, is actually an extension of the censorship that has been applied to Palestinians and even children. You've seen between 2015 and 2016, over 150 arrests of Palestinians due to their Facebook posts expressing opinions on the Palestinian uprising. You've also seen the Israeli government cyber unit set up in 2015 requesting over thousands of posts to be removed and accounts also to be removed from Facebook. And mainly they are accounts belonging to Palestinians. 85% of those requests were acquiesced to by the social media companies. The Palestinian Prisoners Study Center found that between 2015 and 2018, over 500 Palestinians, among them children, were arrested for incitement due to things that they posted on social media, with specific attention paid to Facebook. If we look at what people are being punished for saying publicly now, we do not see that much of a difference between the pronouncements of figures like Jabotinsky, Theodore Herzl, and even Ben Gurion pre the establishment of Israel. You know, of course, it was Jabotinsky that said clearly that no population would willingly submit to a colonial project, and therefore it had to be imposed by force. There is no such precedent, he said. The native populations, civilized or uncivilized, have always stubbornly resisted the colonialists, irrespective of whether they were civilized or savage. You know, there was lively debate about the nature of Zionism prior to the establishment of Israel. Yusuf al-Kabir, a lawyer from Iraq of Jewish Baghdadi background, described Zionism as militant archaeology. He said the following: reconstruction of historical geography, if accepted as practical theory, would, for instance, bring the case to ground and provide a recognized legal basis for any group of people to displace another. If the legal basis is accepted, there remains nothing but to work out history in detail for a suitable epoch. And everyone knows that modern science can do anything. Moreover, if one goes back reconstituting history 2,000 years back, there is no reason why one should not go back still further, say 4,000 or 5,000 years, and presently have the world ruled by militant archaeology. Obviously, we know that Theodore Herzl said clearly that for Europe, we would form part of a bulwark against Asia. There we would serve as the advanced post of civilization against barbarism. When he came to London, he delivered a speech in 1899 where he said, and so I should think that here in England, the Zionist idea, which is a colonial one, should be easily and quickly understood in England. And this is the most modern form of that. We also know that Theodore Herzl was very interested in seeking the support of Cecil Rhodes, trying to appeal to him on a shared basis for the colonial projects. Also, I have seen recently that there is an attempt that in retrospect to sort of Martin Buberize the Zionist movement. Figures like Martin Buber was a spiritual Zionist who was not state-centric about his idea of what the Israeli state should be, or what the yeshuv, the settlement should become. However, this was never somebody with more than 100 or so followers. He was not a big leader of people. To try to define Zionism as it was seen by Martin Buber, or even as we have seen more recently, which is a great injustice, Yemeni and Iraqi and Moroccan people that came to Israel after its establishment, and in the Yemeni case, some of them were among the very first immigration of people. In the case of Yemenis, there were thousands of Yemeni Israelis who had their children taken by the Israeli government and given to other families. Some of those parents were shown supposed graves of their children. It's only come out, there's been 3 investigations, and the Israeli state has decided that there has been no wrongdoing. But they have sealed the documents of that investigation until 2071. Now, to try and now weaponize what Ilan Shohat calls the Jewish victims of Zionism as somehow representative of the Zionist project, to me, is akin to saying because prisoners were taken to Australia, that somehow Captain Cook was not a colonizer. You cannot use things that in such a crude way. So just before I finish off, as I'm aware the time is limited, several days ago, I interviewed Ahad Tamimi, who began protesting against Israeli incursions into her village following the attacks upon her family. Now, when she detailed to me what she was exposed to through the process of being arrested, as hundreds of other Palestinian children are yearly, it struck me how merely recounting what she suffered today in the supposed opposition that we have in this country, that discourse, that reality would be muzzled and would be labeled somehow racist by merely describing that. Are we to tell somebody like her cousin Jenna Jihad, who even began being active because of the murder of several of her relatives by the IDF, she began filming the protests and became a journalist at the age of 7 and taught herself English to be able to reach the rest of the world, and now is in a situation where she sees herself and her friends censored by Facebook? Are we to tell her that her lived experience is somehow racist? Of course not, and never. And that is why we must always stand with those like David, who has for years and years and years put so much work and sweat of his brow into investigating the contours of power. Because if it's David Miller today, then it's the rest of us tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lowkey. That was a fascinating, sobering, and indeed sad analysis there. Thank you so much. I hope we can come back for questions later. Our next speaker is Professor Moshe Machover. Moshe spoke at our meeting last night, from last time from the floor. Today he's going to speak to us as a speaker. Moshe is an Israeli mathematician, philosopher, and socialist activist. And Moshe, we welcome you here today. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I would like to go beyond the details and to look at beyond the individual case on both sides and to explain the background, because I think it's very important to understand it. And I hope not to go on for too long. There is, on the one side, a wide-ranging campaign of calumnies, which is active here, in the United States, in Europe, and beyond. The most visible forces on the offensive against us are the pro-Israel lobby and Israel advocacy organizations. But they are by no means the main or the most powerful forces on the offensive. And it's very important to understand this, that we don't just have to deal with these Israel advocacy groups. They, in fact, are the useful and willing allies in this country of the British establishment, the UK state, and in other places, in other states, in Europe and elsewhere. These advocacy, Israel advocacy and Zionist lobby groups are given so much leverage because of the importance of Israel as a prime strategic asset of United States hegemony regionally in the Middle East and even beyond. In this situation, for example, the British state is doing its job as a camp follower, a subaltern of the United States. We all know about the so-called special relationship between Britain and the United States. But this is not perhaps as special as the relationship between Israel and the United States. So because of this importance of Israel in the structure of American hegemony, it must be ring-fenced. It must be defended against all opposition. All public opposition to the misdeeds of Israel must be stifled and silenced. And this is on offensive side, on our side, so to speak, David Miller is only the current target of this vicious campaign. I think this has been pointed out more than once. He has to be defended not only for his own sake, but because he's unjustly attacked, but because this is part of a general fight to defend truth against lies and justice against oppression. The side of those attacking us is the side of oppression. Our side is the side of liberation. And it goes far beyond David Miller. It goes far beyond the University of Bristol, by the way, in which I used to lecture many years ago in the Department of Mathematics. It goes far beyond the British academic scene. It is, in fact, a question of the whole of civil society, the whole of public opinion in this country, in other countries, everywhere. They want to stifle any opposition to Israel's misdeed. What actually brought about, why did it explode, as it were, so much in recent years? This is important because we have to understand the motives behind it. What brought it on, because this is also a clue to why it is going on now and whether it will continue, how far it will go. Well, there has been a shift in gradually over the years in public opinion perception of the situation in Israel-Palestine. It is to a great extent epitomized by the growing BDS movement. Its success, not so much in achieving its economic aims, but in raising consciousness. I think people don't perhaps sufficiently appreciate how successful this BDS campaign has been in terms of raising public consciousness to the situation in the Middle East. In the United States specifically, this has become quite visible, especially during the Obama years. And significantly, there has been a shift and a greater recognition and understanding among the Jewish population in the United States, especially among younger Jews. And this has alarmed the forces of repression. In this country, recall the popularity of Palestinian solidarity resolutions in the Labour Party conference at the time of Corbyn, the 2017 conference especially. It was very remarkable. And in all his appearances, it was very obvious that among the general public, the politically conscious public, especially among younger people, there has been a huge growth in Palestinian solidarity. This, of course, alarmed the forces that I outlined at the beginning of my talk. And it went into action. And this has escalated its campaign of lies and vituperation. But at the present, as the Israeli colonial settler state escalates its war criminal annexationism and expansionism, more people are going to turn against it. And therefore, we must expect that the campaign of calumnies will also escalate. David Miller is only as I said previously, is only the current target. It will go beyond. We have to be prepared, and we must therefore redouble our counterattack. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Moshe. It's great to hear from you again. And yes, the pressure does seem to be increasing. And of course, David is the tip of the iceberg, and it won't end here. I can see that a lot of people are posting in the chat some very useful sources and also questions. And I will, as we did after the previous meeting, collate the relevant sources and distribute those to people who registered with this meeting. So thank you for those. Our next speaker is Dr. Deepa Driver, who's a trade unionist and academic. Deepa was an observer at the extradition hearing of Julian Assange. And so Deepa is going to speak to us about the topic of freedom of speech, expression and academic freedom in the context of the case of Assange. Thank you, Deepa.
Thanks, Esther. And thank you, everyone, for inviting me to speak. I must admit, I felt a bit nervous because it is a privilege to speak on this panel alongside those whose courage and work I have respected and have learned from over the years. And it is also a privilege to stand in solidarity with a fellow trade union comrade and a fellow academic whose work has contributed so much to our understanding of narratives, of spin, of lobbying, and of manipulation. It is also a privilege to be alongside those in the audience from different walks of life who gather here to show solidarity with David, particularly because I was born in a country partitioned by its colonial British masters. Those of us who are here because we care not just about David and academic freedom, but also about how knowledge is created, how it's developed, how it's disseminated, and how our rights to free speech and association are trampled on or cherished in a democracy. Those who care about knowledge we create do not simply wish to sit in the ivory towers of academia. They also wish to engage with the realities of the world around us so that our academic work can do more to address the burdens and problems that people face around the world. To many of us, academic freedom may seem like a very abstract concept and a very remote idea. Like the right to peacefully protest, it has been taken for granted in much of higher education, and only some have exercised this right with any strength and vigor in the same way as David has. So I thought I might point out some of the features of academic freedom that might be quite nebulous and try and tie it down to something more meaningful. Academic freedom includes the rights to freedom in teaching and discussion, freedom in carrying out research without commercial or political interference, freedom to publish and disseminate one's research findings, freedom from institutional censorship, including, very importantly, the right to express one's opinion publicly about the institution or the education system in which one works, and the freedom to participate in professional and representative academic bodies such as your trade unions, etc. Broader civil rights and civil liberties and human rights are, of course, linked to academic freedom because our educators also have the rights to freedom of thought, conscience, religions, opinion, expression, association, and assembly. And it is important that we all respect that they exercise their civil liberties too. This includes the right to contribute to social change through free expression of opinion on matters of public interest. This right does not fall away when we deal with controversial or sensitive issues. Authoritarian governments and neoliberal patterns of funding research alongside growing pressures to seek sponsorship and neoliberal strategies, of course, of casualized employment, greater precarity at work, have stealthily curtailed many of these rights. At many universities, such as mine, statutes that have enshrined the right to academic freedom have been done away with and subsumed within rather banal and unilaterally alterable HR policies. So there is a veneer of freedom, a veneer of development of knowledge, while the pressures of day-to-day performance requirements within the neoliberal university to meet new managerial approaches to metrics and measurement prevent any meaningful autonomy and freedom. This is bad for us as academics. This is bad for our students. This is bad for our institutions as places of learning, bad for civil society, and bad in the long term for knowledge development. My union, UCU, and my colleagues, particularly those working on the BRAC members standing committee, for example, have pointed out time and again how scholarship has suffered and racism has thrived as a result of powerful and authoritarian influence that seeks to involve us, for example, in criminalizing others, and Prevent is a prime example of such legislation, where including in areas such as national security, funding and self-censorship results in the parroting of establishment lines, and some topics are just too hot to handle. As a UCU report recently pointed out, this is a problem that doesn't just affect scholarship and research in higher education. We are concerned at the number of instances in which academic judgments of educational professionals have been overturned by management for completely non-educational reasons. Educational professionals must have the ability to make decisions without fear of reprisal or penalty. Personally, I've been campaigning for the freedom of Julian Assange, and I'd like to briefly point out, because there are so many parallels, how little has been done on the back of evidence that WikiLeaks, Julian, and Chelsea Manning revealed at great personal cost. Instead, an injustice is being perpetrated as a publisher who published facts which have still not been undermined in any way. WikiLeaks has a 100% record of accuracy. He's locked up in Belmarsh prison, despite winning his case, during COVID, where he is locked down 22 hours a day, at times without heating, and definitely without access to his warm clothing, which was delivered in September. He has a chronic lung condition, and therefore you can imagine the risks that are posed to him during COVID. So this is a situation where war criminals like Tony Blair, Hillary Clinton, and George Bush, and destroyers of life like drone bombing Barack Obama, are feted and paraded as people who provide good sense, while the real people who risk their lives and risk their liberty to tell the truth are undermined. We can see what's happening to David as something of an extension of what's happening to truth tellers like Julian. In Julian's case, for example, it is a very deliberate and well-networked, well-organized strategy by the establishment to silence critics of the system and those who offer dissenting opinions. To get them, people like Julian and Chelsea, who was locked in a box for a very long time and often imprisoned without her clothes, to bear a very, very high personal cost, despite the fact that those who did the crimes that Chelsea and Julian have revealed are the ones who've engaged in seriously criminal behavior. Rather than engaging with the substance of the evidence that these people have revealed, what has been done is they are talked about in very demeaning terms, whether it is talking about Julian's body odor or talking about how he ill-treats his cat or smears feces on the wall. Therefore, I urge you to join us today in publicly and loudly and truthfully proclaiming that we stand alongside David Miller, and we are here to stamp out any efforts by those who use their networks, their positions of influence, and their power to determine what kinds of legitimate inquiry and research are admissible or acceptable. We are also here to stand in defense of those who seek to defense of David against those who seek to tell us which of our colleagues is allowed to carry out evidence-based research and those who seek to police this process. While we are creating knowledge, it is difficult to do so if we are constantly looking over our shoulders or self-censoring our questions because we fear the wrath of those minutely scrutinizing our past history or our words and deeds and hoping to catch us out rather than really engaging with what we have discussed. If we really believe that Black Lives Matter, then we do not flinch when the Black lives that we're talking about are in Iraq, in Afghanistan, or in Palestine. We wish to debate, engage, argue, dissent, and develop and reshape knowledge through the spirit of inquiry. And to do so, we must acknowledge that we live in a society where Islamophobia is a reality that today has resulted in 780 Muslim men being held prisoner without charge and deprived of virtually every basic human right in Guantanamo, for example. And it is at this point that I wish to say that the discussion of Islamophobia is intimately tied to the discussion of Black Lives Matter. The role of academics in challenging racism, in challenging the way in which society constructs situations where those in positions of power are able to stamp out anybody who dissents from their opinion and pretend it's in order to benefit the public interest. These are the things we must stand together against, and I'm proud to stand here as a trade unionist and an academic in solidarity with David, whose work I greatly admire. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deepa. And we've seen from you and from other speakers how this imbalance of power absolutely requires academic freedom that can challenge the power narrative. We're going to move on now to Jonathan Cook. Now, I know that many of my comrades in Bristol enjoy reading your articles, Jonathan. I'm really looking forward to what you have to say. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So both Moshe and Deepa were referring to, as you yourself were, the power imbalance, and were referencing the British establishment's role here alongside the Israel lobby, which is a very important point that we need to bear in mind. But I also wanted maybe to refocus and think a little bit about the audience that is created after we get these kind of imbalance of power, where their narratives are being created. They have an impact and they create an audience. And we have to think, I think, when we're thinking about questions like academic freedom and the plight of David Miller, and not him alone, of course, there's been an assault not just on academic freedom, but also on our cultural and political lives. We can draw parallels with what happened to Jeremy Corbyn, what's been happening to Ken Loach and others, and to Moshe himself. There's an all-round assault on public life. And I think we need to think a little bit about why there is an audience, and maybe think also what we can do to challenge some of the assumptions. I'm going to stray, I'm afraid, maybe a little bit away from political activism, more to psychoanalysis. I think we need to think a little bit about why these narratives that are created by the lobby, by the British establishment, resonate and how they work. And issues like, I suppose, cognitive dissonance, which struck me rather deeply just the other day when I tweeted about this, when the Education Secretary, Gavin Williamson, announced that he was going to try and outlaw no platforming by universities, implying that he therefore regards free speech in academia to be a supreme value. But at the same time, he's also demanding that universities no platform critics of Israel, presumably because he thinks that Israel is the only academic issue where free speech should be denied. So he's holding two contradictory thoughts in his head, assuming that he's not being entirely cynical and speaking in bad faith. But certainly not all Zionists, I think, are acting in bad faith or being cynical. They believe what they're saying. And I think we need to understand why that is, and maybe focus on what is this core cognitive dissonant Achilles heel, if you like, to improve our own activism, our own challenging of this narrative that is created and this audience that is created for this power establishment narrative. It seems to me that Zionists hold dear two important values, which are irreconcilable. And that is one of the reasons that they're so emotionally invested in us as political activists or as academics or as journalists, not challenging these values, not exposing or scrutinizing them. And I think maybe the clearest illustration of that, one that I'm very aware of living here in Nazareth inside Israel, is I call it a Zionist motto, the idea that Israel is a Jewish and democratic state, the idea that this is entirely unproblematic. You hear this a lot in Israel, people talking about a Jewish and democratic state. In the UK, maybe people talk about it more as Israel being the only democracy in the Middle East, but this is really clearly something that's very important to Zionists to believe this, even though to me it seems an entirely fantastical claim that Israel is some kind of normal liberal democracy. The question here is, what does Jewish mean in Jewish state? Does it mean Jewish in a religious sense? Then I think we can point to obvious problems. Nobody suggests that it's possible to have an Islamic and democratic state or a Christian and democratic state. These are clearly problematic ideas. Does it mean Jewish in an ethnic sense? But this seems equally problematic. We could have the idea of a white democratic state. In fact, we've been there before, so we know that this doesn't work either. So it sounds oxymoronic to us, but to Zionists, it doesn't seem that way. It's unproblematic for them. And that's because for them, and Israel has encouraged this, this view, the Zionist movement before it has encouraged this view, the idea is that Jewish means something different. It doesn't mean, it blends these ideas or obscures these ideas of religious and ethnic to create a new idea of a Jewish nation. Now, the problems in that were illustrated many years ago when one of Israel's most famous Supreme Court judges, Meir Shamgar, concluded in one of his court rulings that Israel was a Jewish state in exactly the same way that France is a French state. Now, this doesn't withstand the simplest scrutiny either. How can being Jewish be the same as being French? I can become French by immigrating to France and naturalizing, but I can't do that to become a Jew in that way. The only way I can become a Jew is by converting. So they're clearly not equivalencies at all. Now, how is it that a venerated judge like Meir Shamgar is incapable of grasping the difference between a French nationality and a supposed Jewish nationality? I think we can understand it because he was deeply emotionally invested in the idea of a Jewish state being a normal state, being like a French state. And therefore, he couldn't afford to understand that there was a difference between these two things. Now, I think this is one of the problems for us, which is that in an era of 24-hour rolling news, social media, a much more interconnected world in the digital age, it's very hard to be a Zionist. There's just too much information out there showing you that a lot of your beliefs are simply irreconcilable. Your idea that Israel is Jewish and democratic just doesn't really make sense when it has to confront the reality of what's going on. Now, I spend a lot of my time as a journalist covering these kinds of problems for Israel, how it tries to manage its image and how the evidence, the reality just shows that it's not possible to do so. And I just wanted to plot some of those recent events. I think over the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen a lot of illustrations of how, if you're a British Jew, for instance, it's extremely hard to maintain the idea that Israel is a normal liberal democratic state. Just to identify a few of the major ones, in 2018, Israel passed the nation state law, which gives a right only to Jews to have self-determination in the region, denies that to Palestinians. It sets out a clear ideology of Jewish supremacism. Last year, we saw the Netanyahu government proposing annexation. which was apparently stopped only because some Gulf states like the UAE decided that they were going to do a so-called peace deal with Israel to stop this. But still, whether we want to name it annexation or not, clearly some kind of de facto annexation has been going on. It's been going on for decades, and it's intensifying. And that means that the occupation is becoming permanent. Israel isn't even talking about ending it. It's just talking about a moment in which it decides that it's going to formally annex the occupied territories. We can see it in the recent report just in January by B'Tselem saying that Israel is an apartheid state, because if occupation is permanent, then Israel has created a permanent system of apartheid rule across the region. We don't have two separate areas, one democratic and one non-democratic. It's all not democratic. It's an apartheid system. Then last month, we had the International Criminal Court's decision to investigate Israel for war crimes, including settlements that have been built by every Israeli government over more than 5 decades. We had the decision last month also by the Jewish National Fund, the most venerable of the Zionist institutions, to publicly allocate funds to the settlements. That's, in other words, to subsidize what the International Criminal Court may soon decree to be war crimes. So traditionally, the Jewish National Fund has tried to conceal its involvement in the occupied territories. Isn't something particularly new, but it has concealed it. And the reason it's done that is because it relies on the donations from Jews all around the world, Zionist Jews, to promote its activities, to finance its activities. So now those Jews who are making donations to the Jewish National Fund will be subsidizing directly and explicitly war crimes. And then only yesterday, I wrote a report about Israel's, or Netanyahu's, decision to make an electoral pact with the Jewish Power Party, which is Israel's version of the Ku Klux Klan, to ensure they get into the Israeli parliament. So just to take these few examples over the last couple of years, and some of them just the last couple of weeks, we can see there's a constant onslaught, a barrage of real-world evidence that should shake any Zionist Jew to their core as they try and hold on to the belief that Israel is a normal, liberal, democratic state. So there's a message here in these news events that Zionism is actually a racist, Jewish supremacist, settler colonial ideology. And if you're living in Britain and you identify with Israel, if you want to defend Israel, you have a problem. Now, that doesn't mean that every Zionist in Britain is consciously racist or Jewish supremacist. The ideology may be that. And of course, it's true that many British Jews do not understand what the state is doing in their name. And they may avoid trying to understand that. They may avert their eyes. And there are a variety of reasons why they might do that. And they're not unique to being a Zionist Jew. All of us are capable of this kind of evasion, attempts to try and deal with their own cognitive dissonance. But just to go through some of them, they may not know or understand what is being done in their names. They may find it hard to undo the social, cultural, and ideological programming they've experienced throughout their lives, as have all of us. They may be reluctant to examine or question assumptions on which they've built their wider value system. They may wish to avoid conflict with family, friends, their community, which would be the inevitable outcome of thinking critically and independently on these questions. Or they may prefer to prioritize their fears over reality on the premise that any alternative path, even if it were the right things to do, appears to them to be too risky or costly. Now, psychologists say that cognitive dissonance, the holding or expressing of contradictory ideas at the same time, causes discomfort, stress, and anxiety. Isn't this exactly the visceral reaction that Zionist Jews invested in Israel feel when critics try to talk honestly and frankly about what Israel is and what Zionism means? Isn't this precisely what they're referring to when they accuse us of causing them offense? The problem isn't that we're causing offense. The problem is that those who are offended are unwilling to examine their investment in the act of taking offense. That's illustrated in the refusal by Israel's supporters to allow any scrutiny, any questioning of their contradictory beliefs, such as the idea that Israel is both Jewish and democratic at the same time. The offense argument is too often an implicit admission that they can't justify their beliefs, that they can't square the circle. The responsibility of journalists, of public figures, and of academics like David Miller is not to indulge the pretense that this circle can be squared. It's to articulate our most valid, our most credible assessments of events of the real world, and then test our arguments and claims against those of others. And to do that, we need a level playing field of the kind that universities almost uniquely are supposed to offer. When critics of Israel seek to shine a light where darkness reigns, we threaten strategies of ignorance and evasion, whether individual or communal. Zionists therefore act to shut down critics at all costs in ways that can protect their contradictory beliefs and values. They denounce us as anti-Semites and self-hating Jews. The simplest and easiest, most satisfying solution is to avoid our arguments. It is to reject not what we say, but who we are. David is the latest victim of that campaign, but clearly he won't be the last one. The attacks on David are not simply about shutting down individuals. Their aim is to shut down an entire debate about what Israel is, what it does, and what that means for a colonized, much abused people, the Palestinians. I'll end it there for the time being.
Thank you, Jonathan. I think that's a really interesting angle, and I suppose my thoughts are initially on that, the ways you actually manage and treat cognitive dissonance may not be the ways that we're responding to this phenomenon. So maybe that's something to think about in the questions. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Paramjit Singh Bogal. And Paramjit's a teacher and applied educational psychologist, so maybe you can tell us something about cognitive dissonance. And he's also from the National Education Union. He's going to talk about academic freedom in schools and so forth. Thank you very much, Paramjit.
Thank you, colleagues. If Deepa was nervous, I think I'm sweating, but it's been just great. And what I want to do, I'm going to cut down what I'm going to say because I think it might be really useful for people to kind of have questions and things. And the two things I want to really say is, one is to give my solidarity to David, but also solidarity to the people of Palestine. And in terms of unions, one of the things we can do is actually, it's the collective support in terms of international solidarity. And I'm really proud of the National Education Union and the links it has with many countries, including Palestine, and the work it does in terms of supporting educated children and families. But I'm also, I just want to touch upon something that the National Education Union did. We, just before the end of last year, we passed a motion on a guidance that was passed by the government on relationship, sex, and health education. And people might think, well, why did the Education Union do something like this? It was a piece of guidance that the government wanted to push through, which essentially, the impact of that would have been to actually cut down freedom of speech, actually to cut down on anything to do with talking about things like anti-racism, Black Lives Matter, capitalism, etc. And I think that is no accident if you kind of put it into the context of what's happening in terms of universities and across the globe, where we have national states that squash free speech. And the union passed the motion. And the reason for passing it was because, and it's something which Jonathan touched on, I mean, cognitive, so I'm an educational psychologist, but I'm also, in terms of the work I do, education should not be just about facts and figures. They're useful and they're important, but what's more important is critical and deep thinking skills, because freedom of speech squashes all those. And the way to get a better world is in children, is we take them through things like social emotional development, motivation, cognitive development, linguistic development, creative development, and reflective responses. Because if we want a better world, we don't restrict what we talk about, what we discuss, we open it up. And if we don't do that with little children, with young people who in the end come to the universities, who in the end become academics and thinkers, then if we squash that in primary and nursery stages, then we have a world in which there is no freedom of speech, and their thinking and the possibility of those children actually affecting the narrow curriculum, a colonial kind of curriculum that we have in this country, rather than an anti-racist, a decolonized curriculum, which would, in the words of Gandhi, who said, the greatness of humanity is not in being human, but it's actually in being humane. And I think, so that I'm very proud of the National Education Union in terms of passing a motion, which for the first time ever, it would have put in place a legal challenge, and the government backed down. So at the moment, they've retracted what they were going to do. And I just want to sort of finish on that note in terms of offering solidarity, and collectively across the unions, we can offer support and we can work together. And I think it works. It works. It really does work. So I'll end it there. And I just want to say thank you very much for inviting me, and for the people here. It's just been absolutely amazing listening to just a wonderful collection of speakers that you've had. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Paramjit, and thank you to the NEU. I think you're probably the official opposition at the moment. So let's move on to our final speaker, after which we'll have some contributions from the floor. We have with us today Matt Kennard, investigative journalist and author. You can look at Classified UK and elsewhere to find his writings. So thank you very much, Matt, for joining us today.
Cool, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I guess I think an insightful way I can talk about this is my experience studying in the US at two universities. First, University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, and then Columbia University in New York, because I think it gives a hint of what is coming here and what is happening to David Miller. So I went to UCLA in 2004. And I was a student journalist then. I was in my early 20s, and I became a columnist on the student newspaper there. And I actually started writing columns about Israel and about its relationship with the US. And it was really instructive what happened. I was actually literally and overtly warned off talking about it. And there was one particular case where in 2005, when I was there and I had this column, Norman Finkelstein, he was then a tenured academic. Or actually, he was trying to get tenure, which was eventually stopped. But he was an academic at the University of Chicago, DePaul University. Anyway, he had written this book called Beyond Chutzpah, which had a whole section deconstructing Alan Dershowitz's book, The Case for Israel, basically showing large parts were plagiarized and it was all based on faulty academic work. And that column took a lot of work to even get in the paper. And then subsequent to that, this shows you even a tiny bit of dissonance on this topic. What happens? Alan Dershowitz threatened to sue the student paper. It's called the Daily Bruin. Bear in mind, this is like a marginal paper that no one really reads. And then he demanded, well, he said he was going to sue, and then they said, what can we do? And they said, we'll have to write a letter. So they published a letter from Alan Dershowitz, which was basically just saying that the column was all wrong, which it wasn't. But I think that really gives an insight into how tightly the debate is controlled. And it was much worse in the US. And then subsequent to that, I went to Columbia University to do a master's. And I stayed in contact with Norman Finkelstein, and I was studying journalism there. And my teacher at the time was an editor at the New Yorker. And I said, one of our projects was to write a profile. And I said, I'd quite like to profile Norman Finkelstein. He lives in Coney Island, which was not that far from the university. And this is a literal recollection of what he said. He said, I wouldn't do that if I were you. Criticizing Israel in the US is like criticizing Mother Teresa, you'll never work in the media. So it was very literal. I was being warned off doing this. And actually, at that time, when I also studied in the UK at Leeds, and it was very different. The Palestine solidarity movement was very powerful on campus, and there were big demonstrations. There was an Israel Apartheid Week, which came under a lot of attacks, the usual attacks. But actually, I think what's happening in the UK is what has already been done in the US, which is just this squeezing out any freedom to talk on this issue. And it's a tried and tested technique, and it works. It's this attempt to smudge and blur the line between anti-Zionism or pro-Palestine solidarity and anti-Semitism. And what it is meant to do is impose a cost on anyone who speaks out. That's a personal, reputational, career cost. And it's people will tell you who work in the media, I don't self-censor on this topic. I don't hold back what I want to say, but it's not conscious in that sense. It's this constant attacks on anyone who raises their head above the parapet has an effect which isn't even conscious for a lot of people. And you see that with someone like Nathan Robinson, who was that Guardian columnist who made a flippant joke about Israel on Twitter and lost his column on the Guardian. This happened a couple of months ago, or maybe even a month ago. So and that was in the States. It's so tightly controlled, and that's because I believe that people are scared to defend the people that do put their head above the parapet, like David Miller. And actually, David Miller is an interesting case because a lot of the work I do is about the British establishment and the networks of power which exist in our society. And David Miller's power-based project, which is kind of a Wikipedia of all the different networks that operate across British society, is an invaluable resource. And in fact, he didn't get any sort of trouble like this when he was analysing lobby groups to do with tobacco or different foreign states. In fact, that kind of work was rewarded. As soon as he turned his eye to the Israel lobby, he was widely denounced as an anti-Semite. Well, we've seen it all, anti-Semite, etc. So the lesson that is meant to teach any young academic, any young journalist is: look, if you want to work in the media, if you want to work in the universities, just don't talk about what Israel is doing to the Palestinians. And it's an outrage, because I've been to Palestine a couple of times, and when you see it for real, what is happening to the Palestinians, it's a life-changing event, because it's such a failure of humanity. You have, especially Gaza, which actually I wasn't even allowed into, but you've got 2 million people encaged in an open-air prison, everything about their lives controlled by hostile military power, which routinely bombs them and kills them with snipers when they try and demonstrate at the prison walls. It's just unbelievable barbarism, effectively, and yet there's a system of lobbying in place which instrumentalizes the poison of anti-Semitism to try and to defend it, which in itself is awful, because again, it makes real anti-Semitism much harder to fight if the waters are constantly muddied. But these pro-Israel lobby groups don't care. In fact, pro-Israel lobby groups and Israel itself cozies up to far-right regimes across the world. If you look at Latin America, where I've done a lot of work, the Bolsonaro regime in Brazil, they all love Israel. Argentina, I have family in Argentina. I spent quite a lot of time there. The junta in the 70s, 76 to 83, which was effectively a Nazi-influenced junta. Many of the Nazis fled to Argentina and were allowed to settle there. And the regime that came in, that there were actual real Nazis that were involved in devising torture techniques. They killed 30,000 people, and that was supported by Israel. That regime, they sold them arms. So I think the left needs to really understand that what is happening is there is an attempt to present this racist, brutal military power, which is occupying people in a brutal sense, probably even worse than apartheid South Africa. It's trying to present itself as a progressive cause, and we need to reject that every single time. And the way they do that is to make anyone who speaks up for Palestinians an anti-Semite, to make anyone who speaks up for Palestinians a racist. And of course, it's the inverse. It's an Orwellian construction, because Palestinians are the victims of a racist state. So I think that David Miller is the front line now, but as many people have said, this is never going to stop with David Miller. It didn't start with David Miller. He's just the latest target. They go down the line, and it's about Palestine and it's about Israel. It's not about anti-Semitism. So people need, and what they also try and do is make people suspicious. So they they want people on the left and progressives to be suspicious of anyone who says, oh, I'm involved in pro-Palestine solidarity. They want the first thought to be, oh, maybe that person's an anti-Semite, and we need to reject that completely. Because if they succeed in imposing a cost on pro-Palestine solidarity, then we abandon one of the most silenced and most abused people in the world. So we all need to stand up for David Miller. We all need to stand up for academic freedom, which is vitally important. And we've kind of lost any kind of media freedom on this issue. So academia is the last sort of readout where we can get rational and clinical analysis of what is going on. So we can't let it go down. I'll just finish by talking about a case which happened to me again at university, which was when I was a young reporter. The first big story I really got was about a professor or a lecturer at Leeds who was a racist, a genuine racist. And I interviewed him and investigated his opinions, and it became a big story, got into all the main papers. And the university came under a lot of pressure to fire him. And at that time, I was under pressure to come out and say that he should be fired. And I wouldn't do it because even though I found his views repugnant, academic freedom has to be defended for views that you don't like. Otherwise, you don't believe in it. Everyone believes in academic freedom for people they agree with. So obviously, this doesn't relate to David Miller's case because these are confected charges of anti-Semitism and racism. But even in cases where those charges are real, we would still defend the principle of academic freedom because academic freedom is vital. We can't have a university system where people are scared of talking out whatever their opinions because they think they'll get fired. It's just we need to maintain that, and of course we should really have the same situation in the media, but it's much worse there because the media is even more influential in society. So much more of the lobbying efforts go towards controlling the media. And obviously Jonathan Cook was a reporter with The Guardian once. The Guardian at one stage was pretty good on Israel-Palestine. But like so much over the last 10 years, it's lost its edge. So without that, the media is just basically 100% controlled in its coverage of Israel-Palestine.
Thank you, Matt. So we cannot rely at all on the mainstream media to understand what's happening in Palestine. We will now go back for closing comments to our speakers.
Yes, thank you very much. I think it is essential that we educate ourselves as much as possible about the ways in which power is able to astroturf and disguise its agency, because essentially that's what David's work has focused on in other sectors of the world, but also on this particular issue. Somebody said, can we get a shout out for the Palestine Action campaigners and activists who have been impeding the passage of power from Elbit Systems factories or factories used to produce weaponry for Elbit Systems? It's worth remembering that those brave activists are stepping along a lineage, a proud lineage across the world of those who have taken their civil disobedience out into the sphere that it needs to be. Elbit Systems are known for making cluster munitions, which are banned by international law, white phosphorus shells, which were used against Palestinian populations. All of these things have been condemned by international law. The targeting of civilians is illegal according to Geneva Conventions. They've also been involved in the apartheid wall and got part of the $2.5 billion project on building a wall between the US and Mexico as well. But let's not forget, it's about 17 years since the International Court of Justice said Israel building that barrier was in fact illegal. So what we see are those who are, and the UK is bound by the International Trade Arms Trade Treaty to work out whether the things that it is signing or giving the stamp for exports for are likely to be used in human rights violations. Well, we've had clear evidence that Israel is likely to use these things in human rights violations. And these brave activists have put their futures and have put themselves on the line to support and protect Palestinian life as much as they can. And so they deserve our solidarity and our support. And there's 2 of them who are currently in prison now. So please look up Palestine Action and support them in what they are doing. And everybody has a part to play. Perhaps that's a role for others. But again, the precedent that has been set is when people have been brought into court and charged with things like this, like disabling the factories, what it has done is flipped the accuser and accused dynamic and puts Israeli war crimes on trial. And so that's why you've seen from the Raytheon 9 to others, you have not seen people convicted of these crimes, because all the court cases is an opportunity to show Israeli war crimes for what they are. So I would invite more people to take part in civil disobedience and more people to support those who do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lowkey. We'll put details of that when we contact people afterwards. Moshe, are you still there? Do you want to make some closing comments? Is Moshe still here? Yes, hello. Over to you, Moshe.
I finally managed to unmute myself. Thank you. Yes, I would like briefly to address what Jonathan Cook pointed out. Jonathan, whose reports and blogs from the Unholy Land are a wonderful, wonderful resource. And Rada Karmi, an old friend. Yes, there is a question of cognitive dissonance, and there is a question, as Rada Karmi pointed out, of a lot. I mean, Zionist Jews are such because they have internalized the idea that Zionism is part of their Jewish identity. It is a sort of surrogate religion. I don't think there's any way to deal with it except by confrontation with reality. What happens? We shouldn't lose hope, because there are now quite a number of people here, remarkably in the United States, among the Jewish community and in Israel itself, who are changing, who are getting a release from this tension of cognitive dissonance. Let me mention just 2 very famous cases, but I mean, they are just emblematic of many. I mean, there is the case of Peter Beinart, a prominent Zionist writer in the past, who is, well, I mean, he would still define himself as a Zionist, but with such Zionists, I think, you know, we can live. I mean, if all Zionists were like him, you know, it wouldn't be so bad. Who has actually changed and made a public declaration of the change that he has undergone because of his confrontation with reality. Reality is, after all, the best cure for cognitive dissonance. And there is the question of Avraham Burg. There is an example of Avraham Burg, who used to be the speaker of the Knesset, who used to be the head of one of the most important world Zionist organization, the Jewish Agency. He has moved. He has moved. Again, you know, he will still say that the establishment of Israel was a just thing, but I mean, with his brand of Zionism, it wouldn't be so bad. And people are, these are just 2 prominent cases, but there are lots of them who are not so well known. So I think that rather than try to, as it were, psychoanalyze them and try to, as it were, cure them with various psychological means. I think we should simply concentrate on making the reality better known. And this is what Jonathan Cook excels in. So, I mean, the problem Jonathan raised is in fact best cured by what he's actually doing.
Yeah, thank you very much, Moshe. I think we're all learning new things today and thinking about things differently. Are you still there, Deepa? I've just heard that Roger Waters is here, and we might ask him to speak if he's able to, perhaps after Deepa. Deepa, are you there?
I am indeed. It might just be your screen, Esther, because if you move it to gallery view, hopefully you'll be able to see the rest.
Yeah, I can see you now. There you are.
Yeah. Yes, I do have a few thoughts, and I'd like to respond specifically to the question around what can we do, I think, which Tina asked at the start, and talk about a few things that I think we can do, whether it is in relation to David, or whether it's in relation to Assange. I think the first has to be a recognition that we have nothing to be ashamed of. We are here proud, we are here strong, because we are speaking the truth and we are standing up for what is right. And so, firstly, it's important for us to feel confident in what we're saying, because that helps to create greater calm and a greater ability to challenge some of the kinds of responses that we get without being too defensive. I think secondly, it is often underestimated how much we can change opinion, because clearly not all of us are in control of the mass media, which is heavily controlled by those in establishment positions. We're not in control of politics, which is run by the Eton boys. So it becomes, you kind of lose your sense of agency when you are participating in these important conversations, but have no power. And I think part of reclaiming that power is recognizing that we do have control, at least over our spheres of influence, whether it is within our trade unions, within our constituency Labour Party, or within our local Green campaign, or within our friendship circles and within our family, to talk about some of these issues and make at least those who are not aware of these issues, whether they are older or younger than us, aware of what the issues are, and to engage with them and to debate with them respectfully about what's going on. I also think it's important to, if you are a member of a trade union, to please pass motions in your union branch to show support for David, to show support for Julian Assange, because these might seem like gesture politics, but actually they make a big difference to where the establishment feels it's able to step against us. The more we make our views known, the more likely it is that they will be afraid, as they've retreated on so many things. I think it's also important to recognize, and this is something that I take I say from personal experience, that it's not, for example, all Black people who will push the cause of Black people. So, for example, Priti Patel and Rishi Sunak aren't going to be dealing with the lived experience that those of us who are further down this societal hierarchy have. And it is important to recognize and create allies amongst those who may not necessarily look like us or sound like us, but actually share with us the values and the important solidarity that we show with people like David. And it is this that must be cherished and must be pushed forward. And also, it is important for us, very important, to defend the rights of those whom we do not agree with, because it is in allowing them to speak and having serious debate and allowing them freedom of expression that we cherish our own. And that would be my response. I also wanted to slightly respond to Ron Mendel's question, if I may, Esther, but I might come back to that once others have spoken.
Okay, thank you. Is Roger here, Roger Waters?
Perfect.
We can hear you.
Oh, good. All right. Well, here I am. I've been very interested and moved by what all these wonderful speakers have had to say through here, and obviously solidarity to David Miller. I mean, we wake up every morning, don't we? All of us, everybody in this community, and we look around us and we're gobsmacked by what is going on around us, and it's very difficult to figure any of it out. particularly given all the cognitive dissonance and so on and so forth, I was very moved by, I can't remember his name, but the guy talking about education, because this is so fundamentally important that we get to generations of school children in order to help them unburden themselves from whatever version of primal disdain they may have lodged deep within the crevices of whatever it is that makes people behave badly in later life, if you see what I mean. And then we go to the internet and look at the news, and suddenly there's the news and it says Cambridge County Council and Cambridge University both endorse the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. And then we tear our hair out for a bit and think, what? I'm from Cambridge. What are you talking about? That's insane, and blah, blah, blah. And then we calm down a little bit and think, what do we do next? Well, we do what you guys have been doing so perfectly for the last hour or so here. We talk to one another. And wouldn't it be wonderful if conversations like this actually provided us with policy? But of course they don't. Policy is by and large sculpted by Sheldon Adelson and other rich people all over the world. I'm not picking Sheldon out, except that he's sort of pick-outable at the moment, given the context of this conversation. And they shape the minds of the young growing up. That's what the young look at on their iPhones all day. When you're sitting and you look at them and that, they're having this shit poured into their ears from both sides. So the rational conversation that Jonathan Cook or David Miller would have with any of us or with anyone in the world gets pushed to one side by all this nonsense. And it's pushed to one side, let us be fair and honest, by cash. It's pushed to one side by the profit motive. That's what is defining our lives. And that is why we're all here sitting with our laptops for 2 hours this morning, listening to these great speakers. And I'll shut up now because I've spoken for too long. But except to say one last thing, further to the couple of comments I made about the Labour Party and John Ware and the BBC and the BBC's appalling descent into becoming a mouthpiece for right-wing stuff and also pro-Israeli lobby stuff, like in the Panorama documentary, Anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. Naomi Winborn-Adrisi, I'm with you. We're going to fight this thing together, and we will not lie down in front of their absurd accusations against Labour Party members of many, many years standing who've done nothing in their lives except support the values that the Labour Party should be about. And the sooner we get rid of the Blair clone, Keir Starmer, from the ranks of the Labour Party and reinstate somebody who's actually interested in the rights of and lives of working people, the better. Right, shut up, I've finished.
Thank you, Roger. Solidarity with you, and then solidarity, by the way, with Naomi, if you're here today. It's good to see you.
All right.
So moving on then to Jonathan. Jonathan, your closing remarks, please. Have we found Jonathan?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, great. Well, I don't think I need maybe to address Rada's point because Moshe did it very well. I just say that, yes, the problem is that Zionist Jews have absorbed Israel into their identity. And it seems to me that that emotional investment derives from fear that has been generated in them by decades of propaganda, by the Zionist movement and by Israel. And so what's happening here is that the lobby is weaponizing our truth-telling. I mean, it's weaponizing anti-Semitism, but what it's trying to do is make the truth we tell sound sinister and dangerous to Zionist Jews. So they're trying to create a vicious cycle for us here. The more truth we tell, the more afraid British Jews are supposed to feel. And as Moshe says, that fear comes from ignorance, doesn't it? So the strongest medicine we have is to speak our truth clearly, rationally, precisely, and make sure we don't engage in half measures, because half measures can be used and turned against us. I mean, the lobby feeds off our half measures, and I think that was a lesson that maybe the supporters of Jeremy Corbyn should have learned if they didn't learn it from his experience. The other thing I wanted to address was Tina's point about she noted that criticizing Israel now comes at a cost, and that's undoubtedly true. But I also think we should remember that it comes at a cost now because we have a bigger voice than we've ever had before. I think most of the people here are old enough. I mean, I talk to a lot of student groups and I have to tell them what it was like 20 years ago because they don't know. But, you know, we're all old enough, or most of us are old enough to know that 20 years ago, the best people like us, the best we could hope for was getting a letter in the Guardian letters page. You know, that was the most of a voice that you had on a platform that wasn't a town hall meeting. So, or maybe you could get yourself an article in a newsletter that was published 3 times a year and went to 50 people. You know, that was really, that was our tiny weapon against the enormous power of the corporate billionaire media. And we have a much bigger weapon now. Okay, it's not perfect. You know, I'm not the biggest fan of social media and all the rest of it, but we do have the internet. We have, as long as these corporations continue to let us use these platforms, we have the ability to reach out, to educate ourselves in ways that were never true before, share information, to organize. These are tools that are vitally important. So the reason we're seeing this backlash, the reason that we're being criticized, we're being attacked, we're being smeared like never before is because we have more power than ever before. We have an ability to reach out and engage with each other and share information as we've never had, as maybe no humans have ever had before. So let's take advantage of this moment to tell our truth and to speak clearly, confidently, boldly, and not engage in half measures. And again, solidarity with David, and thank you for inviting me on this platform.
Thank you, Jonathan. Solidarity and no half measures, definitely messages we'll take away from today. We've got Matt, are you still there? I don't know if you're still there, Matt, to give any closing remarks. Hello.
Can you hear me?
Over you for closing remarks, please. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you. We can't see you, but we can hear you.
Okay, let me try and. All right, that's not going to work. All right. I guess I'll just end with to talk about. Oh no, it's not working in the video. Academic freedom in general as a principle and how important it is, and how this issue, although obviously the proximate reason for the meeting is the case of David Miller and the attacks he's coming under, and effectively the campaign to get him fired. Universities in our society are one of the few institutions and parts of society left where there is lively dissent and a free exchange of ideas, and that is a problem for the powers that be, whether that be state power, corporate power. They have effectively, in the neoliberal period, in the last 25 years, colonized every single aspect of our society. Corporations are more powerful than ever now. They've really penetrated the media, culture, everything. And universities, of course, have been penetrated by corporations too. But there is this norm that respects academic freedom, and I think that is changing, and there is a concerted attack on academic freedom, and you see that with the lack of support for David Miller within the mainstream. I mean, even people who on the right who claim to be against cancel culture and for free speech, you'd expect them to come up with and defend David Miller. You've hardly seen any defense of David Miller. In fact, all the mainstream columnists have come out and attacked him. So in that context, you see, it's very worrying, because if we lose universities as a free place and a free for free exchange of ideas, as people have mentioned, young people are going to stop being exposed to ideas which will help them form a rational analysis of society, and will help them go into a world with values and principles which they need to be rounded people. So I think that we all need to support David Miller, obviously, but we need to understand this is part of a bigger assault on academic freedom by corporations, by state power, collectively, that can't succeed. We can't allow it to succeed.
Thank you, Matt. And actually, Waparanjit left a message in the chat to say that he had to leave. So I'm sure that you would have echoed some of the things that you said there with specific reference to younger children. Thank you very much. So I've had various comments in the chat. Can we hear Chris speak? Chris Williamson, are you there? Would you like to?
Indeed, yeah. No, thanks very much indeed.
Contribution, please. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you very much indeed for an excellent meeting, and all of the speakers have made a wonderful contribution, I think, today. And this has been I think, a highly successful meeting with, I think, around 300 people in the Zoom meeting who were registered, and then of course we streamed it onto Facebook as well. So I think it's really had hopefully a beneficial impact today. And I just want to really echo the words of Roger Waters, really, when he said we mustn't lie down. He's absolutely right. That's something that I was arguing for really when I was still a member of the Labour Party. I think part of the problem has been that we've treated these accusations from bad faith actors as if they were making complaints in good faith, and we know that they're not making it in good faith at all. And it's so crucial, therefore, that we use today's event and events like this to draw an absolute solid line in the sand and say this far and no further. And the fact that there wasn't an appetite from enough people to stand up to these bad faith actors has led us directly to the situation that we're facing today, where an esteemed academic like David Miller is facing potentially losing his career. And it's an absolute outrage. And of course, David's not the only one that's being targeted, perhaps the most high profile one, but it's so important, therefore, that we support him. And I would urge everybody, if you're not already a member of the Labour Campaign for Free Speech, to please join, and also consider perhaps contributing to the Legal Fighting Fund, the Left Legal Fighting Fund that I helped to set up with others, to try and defend people from these spurious accusations. And it's so important that we do stand together, because all we've got is each other. When we stand together in solidarity, we're very powerful. And we're a match for any lobby, however powerful it may be. But we need to stand in unity. We need to stand in solidarity. And as Roger says, do not lie down, stand up and be counted.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you all. And I will read, as my closing comment, one of the comments made by one of the people who wanted to speak and wasn't able to, Norman Thomas. The time for talk is over. We must act in solidarity with David. We must bombard the newspapers with letters. We must target every radio phone-in, every TV political programme. We must shout and cry out. David Miller must not go undefended. So thank you, Norman, and thank you all.
Solidarity, comrades.
Thank you.
Solidarity, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.